Sorry, I was a couple minutes late. Sorry to
No
keep you
worries.
waiting.
No worries. Not a problem at all. Um, so, my name is Zeke Jones. I'm a Master's of Architecture student at the University of Texas. Uh, and I'm here with Jesse LeCavalier, who is a designer, writer, educator, and founder of LeCavalier Research and Development, as well as an associate professor of architecture at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture at the University of Toronto. And the director of the PhD program. Jesse, thank you very much for joining me. And
My
so
pleasure.
I'm super interested in uh, the topics that you focus on in terms of infrastructure and logistics, and sort of centering architectural attention on things that maybe don't get enough attention or accommodate many people. Uh, and architects just don't talk about them. I have a question that I think I want to start off with that hopefully we can frame your work or your interests by. And this is coming from my friend Martin Janssens, who I just had a really cool conversation with about your work. And it is the warehouses of Walmart and Amazon that you research and visualize seem to stem from a desire for everything by everyone. In this light, do you see these warehouses more as a democratic architecture, an architecture by the people, or an architecture of greed, an architecture for the people? And sort of to, I guess, add to that, when you analyze these things, are you analyzing them critically, journalistically, as potential earnest interventions? Uh, it's a big question, I know.
Yes. um, I think maybe you could clearly understand the first part of the question about the sort of the like democratic dimension of the warehouses. I think, could you maybe just explain that to me one more time, the question?
Okay, so the question
The
is,
last part I understand. The first part I could use some clarity.
okay, so I think what he's asking is, do you see these architectures as for people? Like, is there any sort of
Mm,
democratic intention in them? Is there any sort of altruism inherent in the types that you are researching?
mm, I see. Um, well, I think that if you, so yeah, thank you for the question. Again, thank you for the chance to chat more. It's it's one of the real pleasures of being able to go to places is you can take more time to spend time getting to know the people who are there. So it's of course sad that we can't do that in person, but this is at least a chance to talk outside of the channel of the lecture. So I'm really happy to be able to do it. So I would say that the warehouses of like a Walmart logistical system are not anything close to democratic, because they're really about a single system of infrastructural pursuit. But I don't think that infrastructure is inherently like that. So I think that one of the things that I'm really interested in is how infrastructure, which is broadly defined, but how infrastructure can become directed toward other kinds of uses in support of other kinds of value systems. And so what we see with something like Walmart is a certain kind of infrastructure directed toward a certain kind of value system, which is maximizing economic utility for consumers, basically making things as cheap as possible for people in order to support a business model. And so that's one value system. But that, as we know, comes at great expense. And that produces really fascinating architectural outcomes and urban design outcomes, but it also produces really like troubling ones, and it also does a lot of damage. But the effort to try to understand the workings of that system was what motivated the research. And so to the second question, it's a combination. I wanted to pursue it with sort of open eyes as much as I could to say, to not enter into the material with a kind of preconceived notion of what I would find. But I harbor a lot of suspicion for any kind of large corporate entity, especially the largest one on the planet, which is what Walmart is. And so it's, I think the book itself is probably less critical, perhaps, than I would have liked it to have been, and that was perhaps a reflection of my own efforts to keep it sort of academically distanced. But I think but I don't think those are mutually exclusive, and I think that's something that when I look back on it, I think it would have been. I think there were some missed opportunities to be more pointed about some critique, but there's some of those things are, I guess I see as more implicit, but they might be a little bit more disguised. So I think that the question about how, to what extent is this a kind of like earnest set of ideas about engagement with that material? I mean, I think that for me, the book raised a lot of questions personally about what infrastructure is, how to design it, and why and how it is difficult to think of it as a design thing. It tends to be a kind of diffusely authored thing, and as a result, I think it can be hard to find entry points. It can be hard to find ways into those systems, and so I don't know if, well, let's see, let me say it differently. For me, that one of the outcomes is not to figure out to design a better logistical system for something like Walmart. But I think that there is a lot of power in the behavior and intelligence of logistical systems that can be directed to other models, which is what I have been trying to like extract and translate.
So it's not necessarily that the architect has agency in that specific system. I mean, I guess they do to a certain extent in terms of developing some sort of prototype or being executive architect. But you're saying that you want to take the logics of logistics and apply them in other architectural scenarios, or just other scenarios at large?
I think you could say that's one way to say it. Yeah, I mean, I think the architects, so like the architects at Walmart, for example, at least when I was doing the research about the book, there's a group of them, 10 or 20. They are a subset of the real estate division, and their charge is to develop prototypes and to translate, to help troubleshoot the kind of compatibility issues that emerge through the instantiation of prototypes. And part of the kind of motivation for the project came from a question about how could a company so big open so many stores so quickly? How do you possibly just like build that much stuff so quickly? Because that's, I think, what is, so one of the many things that's fascinating about the company is that amongst these Fortune 500 companies, these like global behemoths, most of them don't have the same reliance on buildings the way that Walmart does. So like Walmart needs buildings because that's where people buy the things that they sell, and so they need to like encumber real estate. They need to employ contractors. They need to build all the time. And so how do you possibly do that at that scale? And so for me, it was a kind of study in how you scale up an operation, and what I was learning is about how the power of this prototype model works. And so the company develops these this stable of these prototypes that then have a looseness to them that then can be quickly adapted on the ground to become compatible with structural alignments, site-handedness, and things like that. And so a lot of what the architects do is almost at the scale of kind of operational engineering. But the idea of the prototype as a kind of loosely defined architectural idea, for me, it seems very powerful because it gives us as designers a different kind of tool set that doesn't maybe rely on a kind of insistence on perfection, but is a much more supple, much more adaptable model. But you then would also need to then have an idea about a network of them. And so the prototype only makes sense as a network of prototypes. So just a single prototype instantiated once doesn't obviously show you much about the power of the prototype. But if you have a whole fleet of them, you see how the system then is able to function, but also can adapt to its locality. So I think that's for me one of the ideas that I think I've been trying to think about how to translate at different scales. So it's a different kind of authorship. It's not so much like form making, what LeCavalier usually would call object form. It's not like defining an envelope or like defining geometry. It's more about defining a set of operations and relationships. And then, so one has to, I think, become a little bit, well, so I guess for me, what I think I'm trying to figure out is like how that approach could actually become generative of a sensibility, so that it's not to say that one has to become indifferent to formal outcomes, but that through that process, a different kind of form emerges that has a different set of qualities, or that it's not giving up on the things that make architecture rich. And I think that's where, like, the Walmart example is not an instructive example once you get past the sort of operational dimension, because of the spaces themselves and the things like that, the materiality that's driven by their operational leanness, basically.
Got it. But you also talk about that, we talk about the leanness and the prototype as being something that is incomplete, or you use the word slack, or having a slackness. So what does that bring, room for like a sense of place? I was actually reading something last night for Sarah Lopez's class, who I understand is going to introduce you in 25 minutes. And it was a quote by Henry Lafarbe. And actually, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he says, Lafarbe sees a commonality between the tract home, or this is Dolores Hayden talking about Lafarbe. Lafarbe sees commonality between the tract home, the identical suites in corporate skyscrapers, and the identical shops in malls, suggesting that a quality of late capitalist space is the creation of many identical units, similar but not placeless places. And I sort of see the placeness coming partially from that slackness. And so I'm wondering if there is sort of a new vernacular that comes from the slackness and the ability to incorporate the prototype, neoliberal prototype, or whatever it is, the capitalist agenda, into that place. Is that a language in itself and a vernacular?
I think that it's I think that there are a few things to think about with that. I mean, I like the question a lot as we think through how to deal with specificity. And so I wonder if, well, I think one thing to start with is just to think about vernacular really as a kind of, in its like linguistic origins, rather than thinking of it as a stylistic question. So to think about how what we might call architecture vernacular is really something that's developed through a kind of shared set of knowledge that's not that's maybe locally driven because of specificity related to a material or traditions of assembly or production. And so certainly something like global logistical systems that spill out into the scale of a building production tend to not do that in an authentic way, but do that in a superficial way. So Walmart has these kind of hokey gestures of locality, where they specify stucco or timber in Colorado or whatever, but is really just a kind of superficial way of thinking about that. So I think it raises questions about what we value and what we might want to bring out as something that's local, that's shared, and we might wonder how architecture could support that. And so I think that's where this infrastructural layer for me is compelling when we start thinking about what constitutes a local infrastructure. And when one looks through some of the literature about infrastructure, one thing that people point out is that it's linked to senses of membership. So for example, if you've traveled to a place where it has different plugs, that's weird, right? We're not used to like what's the 3 square prong thing, and or what are the like angled ones? Like, why do they have that? I need an adapter to plug my phone in. But then the opposite is true. Like the inverse is also true. So is that a form of vernacular membership where you speak a certain language because you have a certain set of plugs? And as a metaphor, could that get translated into how we might think about structuring the future of the built environment through creating a kind of equivalent set of local infrastructure vernacular that might help foster some sense of collective understanding? I mean, for me, I'm interested in this question. I mean, I'll talk about this in the talk with some of the research on the Meadowlands, because that's been sort of a driver. We've been using this phrase infrastructural vernacular as a way to try to make sense of these things that are not vernacular in the sense that they're not like handcrafted. These are like oil tanks and radio towers, but they're specific because of the strange core sort of alchemy of or the strange kind of admixture of the Meadowlands that brings all these together to produce a kind of like vibe, basically, to use a really technical term. And so I think that that's something that can be, to what extent can that become translated so something might feel familiar but not like reductive or not not superficial, basically, like it's something that's generated by a place, but not through easy kind of pastiche modes, but more through a kind of grammar, let's say.
That makes sense. It reminds me of the beaches, or the beach cities in Los Angeles, where that infrastructure is so much a part of that place, even if it wasn't intended to be. And it's interesting to see how people start to even shape it formally, or like when the city intervenes, how they shape it formally, and how much different that is, and how much more occupied that part of the beach is even than infrastructures that are sort of look like they were untouched by an architect. So that's super. I'm really, really interested in this because I'm doing a project on landfills right now in studio. And I think your Meadowlands project touches on that a bit. And I think, there's sort of the European movement, or at least more momentum in terms of, like Kirsten Geer's, David Van Severin's Architecture Without Content, and Jobs Flores, Monadnock, Kamarakuo, are, these, maybe, I don't know if they're state-run competitions or what, but it seems like there's more of a focus on these types of systems and architecturalizing them. But do you think that there's value in that, or is there more value in sort of the functional aesthetic that exists inherently in them, in their engineered systems?
How would you summarize the former, like what you were calling like the sort of European
I guess
systems design?
I guess I was thinking, like, it seems like they're trying to really bring it into the architectural realm. Like there's more of a discourse around the aesthetic of infrastructure, and it actually gets architecturalized and designed by architects and published as within the architectural discourse. And, I'd imagine that large swaths of the Meadowlands, aren't published on Divisare or ArcDaily or whatever it may be. So I'm just wondering, like, is there a value in the Meadowlands approach, or do you see possibility in the European approach?
I think that, well, let's say, I mean, if all these places need design, I think. So, maybe that's one way to say it, that there's, that we could learn a lot from these models you're describing, because they bring a set of, like, if design is about deliberate authorship and deliberate direction of resources into improving how something can be used by people, then yes, definitely we need so much more of it. one thing to remember, I think, is the old adage or whatever, the kind of truism that like only 1% or whatever 5% of the world that we see is like built by architects. That's because the rest of it is built by giant architecture, engineering, and construction firms, and that's a $90 billion industry that is really designing and building. And there's plenty of people who are totally who are wonderful people, dedicated and to their craft in that sector, but the values are different. And so I think what the examples you're thinking of in these European contexts, I think we could learn a lot from, because they to my mind reflect a larger collective value in design and a willingness to invest in it. And they also reflect a relationship to a state that is willing to direct resources toward that. So we might start with just, the state of our state is not such that it will allow that. And I think this is one of the issues, is that the private sector has been allowed to do so many things that it wants to do without larger sets of considerations. And so that allows values to get also kind of realigned. But I think that we also don't, I'm interested, I think, in finding other forms of institutions that could support a kind of middle out approach to this infrastructural questions that's neither the kind of privatization, decentralization, laissez-faire approach, nor the sort of heavy-handed top-down approach of the past. That neither of those are that satisfying. And so another category I think is necessary that lets decentralized institutions come together to drive things locally, but that requires modeling, and that requires other kinds of interventions. But all of that, if all of that let design play more of a role in these things, we would be so much better off, I think, because so one of the things I'll also talk about is food systems, which have suffered from a lack of design. And I think that if we were to think about it, if we were to take all the sort of tools of creativity, like any given architectural design studio is so full of creativity, and at a certain scale tends to then become difficult to transport into implementation because of the kind of bureaucratic opacity of infrastructural design, which is something why I think it's interesting we bring these examples up in a European context, because there's a tighter relationship. There's also there's a very different context. So like the Swiss context is a tiny, super wealthy state that has very few of the problems and challenges that the states face, for example. But at least they're able to do it well. So I'm really interested in creating a category of designer that is something like an infrastructuralist or something. And we don't really have that. You can think of countless numbers of like small scale sort of critical practices, boutique architectural practices. There's no such thing as like a boutique infrastructural practice. Like you can't do it because of the scale of the operation. And so how can we, instead of just accepting that, how can we rethink that? And so I'm this is something I'm interested in pursuing. I think there's no easy answer to it, but I do think that there's a lot of institutional challenges to that. And so in the context of the Meadowlands, there's not really much architecture, so to speak. I mean, there are public parks that are well used and well loved, but I think that there's, and any work there would have to, of course, involve all of the people who are involved with that place, who've been working really hard to improve that place. Like I think of the groups like the River Keepers, or there's a number of course, really like incredibly active, incredibly hardworking, dedicated community groups who've been trying to improve that place for decades. And so I think the question would be, how can design support their efforts as well?
That's a great answer. I think we got to wrap it up, because I want to give you time to prepare for your lecture. But I wish I could ask you so many more questions, because I would absolutely love to be that boutique industrial designer that you're trying to shape. So I look forward to finding out those answers, hopefully at some point in time. And I look forward to your lecture.
Yeah, well, my lecture might not necessarily have all the answers, but I know I'm sorry that we can't talk longer. Because it would be nice. I'd love to hear more about the studio that you're doing, and who is teaching that studio.
It's Piergiana Mazoka. She's the emerging design fellow. She's actually going to go get her PhD after this at Cornell, and she's interested in health specifically, but feels as a component of health and medicalization of architecture specifically.
Got it.
But it's been super fascinating to learn about, and like everything that you are interested in, I'm just so for it, and I really hope that architecture can sort of find its way more into that realm, because it's so much a part of our everyday lives as people, as normal people. So
totally. Yeah, and it affects a lot more people. I mean, I think the kind of like client-based model of kind of beautifully crafted things is of course totally amazing, but it's a kind of patronage model that I think we have to think about expanding, to think about how design can reach more people.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you so much, Jesse. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Yeah, sorry that we couldn't talk longer, but thanks for the great questions.
Absolutely. Thank you for the great answers. I will, I guess, see you on another screen in 10 minutes.
Sounds good. I'm going to sign on now.
All right. See ya.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.